Welcome to ednews.com. It's your host, EJ Carrion, and today we have Audrey Watters, creator of hackeducation.com, a famous blog around education, and an author of a new book that came out in August called Teaching Machines, The History of Personalized Learning. Audrey, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so what I would love to know, as someone who is an education entrepreneur who works in public education, I would love to know what do you think? I know you talk about the history of EdTech, and EdTech more than ever right now through COVID thinks it's their moment. You talk about it's always their moment, but what is your kind of take on what's kind of the landscape right now in education and how innovation and EdTech seem like it's their moment of opportunity?
That's such a great question. There are a couple of different ways that I would want to answer it. One, of course, would tie into the book. But the first thing I would say is that it may well be a moment of opportunity for EdTech. Certainly, that is the sunny way to tell the story. But I think that what we're also seeing is a great deal of disillusionment about EdTech. I think that a lot of folks have heard all the promises and when I say folks here, I mean both students and teachers, and perhaps not for the first time, but perhaps quite powerfully, parents are looking at EdTech and saying, wow, this isn't great. This doesn't make things better, easier. Students aren't learning better, they aren't learning faster. All of the promises that we hear about how tech is going to improve education, I'm just not sure that this is actually what's being demonstrated. So while on one hand, I think that many people, entrepreneurs in particular, advocates for EdTech, might think that this is their moment, I think we should be cautious about that, because I think for other people, this is actually the moment in which resistance to EdTech might actually get a stronger hold as well. Yeah, and then as far as the book goes, and I think that that's the interesting thing, is that EdTech has always seen itself as this moment. One of the reasons that I wanted to write this book is that I do think that it's important to recognize that so much of what is being talked about, the stories that we tell about what EdTech can do, what schools need, that it's not new, that these are actually issues, practices, technologies even, that we can trace back at least a century. And so the idea that we are seeing all of this innovation, when you look at it through a historical lens, it actually doesn't look that transformative. And the ideas that are being sold right now perhaps aren't even that innovative.
Yeah. What would you be your, because you also kind of mentioned how is personal learning kind of what we need, in the sense of a lot of the skills we need is understanding community and togetherness. And it seems that us to feel that that's still holds in public education. And if public education feels the most friction in the US, where most of the book is focused on, it seems like even parents are questioning the public education, or it's maybe because of George Floyd and the increase of homeschooling from Black and brown families to the flexibility that comes from homeschooling, and some families seem to enjoy it, or even the competition from smaller schools like charter, and maybe even the consideration of private schools. What do you feel like you would like to see more being talked and addressed about actually how public education may not be the thing not meeting the kids' needs, and it's more the aspirational EdTech that's actually not meeting the moment?
Yeah, I think that both are true, right? I think it's really important to recognize that the public school system in this country, again, taking a historical lens, but also just looking at what we have today, that it doesn't work. It doesn't work for everybody. Or if it works in ways that have for a very long time now helped to perpetuate inequality, right? So there are certain students that benefit greatly from the way in which the system functions, and there are students that don't. And historically, we We can look at how schools came to be, who schools sought to serve, and the moments, I think the particularly powerful moments, though, I'm in defense of public schools when the American society has decided that we do demand, not just want, we demand that schools serve more people, that schools serve everybody. And I think that that is the aspiration of the public school system, is that they do serve everyone. They're not rooted in that historically, right? And I think that when we look at the foundations that we've sort of built this system on, there are parts of the foundation that are rotten, right? I mean, I think that there are ways in which we can look at how white supremacy, for example, is sort of a foundational part of the school system. Class inequality, really a foundational part of the public school system. But we have throughout history also expanded access. We have reshaped schools so that more people can attend, right? So that more people can participate. And ideally, I think Americans in general, I think, really do believe that education is a powerful way to transform both individuals' lives and to improve society as a whole. So I think we have this belief that public education is such an important way forward. But I think we have to be realistic and recognize that by design, in so many ways, and historically, we have inherited a system that is full of inequalities. And I think what's dangerous about ed tech is that ed tech doesn't often recognize that it actually perpetuates and even exacerbates some of those very same inequalities. The way in which ed tech looks, for example, in an affluent school is quite different than what ed tech looks like in a school that's populated by students from lower socioeconomic class or students of color. And I think experiences with ed tech, just as like experiences with the system, are full of inequalities.
Yeah. We have the American Rescue Plan and a once in a lifetime kind of investment into our education system. Are you being asked, or do you have suggestions on how we should be asked how should we be, I guess, investing in our public education today, and maybe not being so, I guess, attracted to the aspirational marketing of ed tech services who are trying to capitalize on this moment?
Yeah, I think there are so many things that I think it's sort of like queen for the day, sort of what would you do? And I think that, it's so hard because it's this is part of, I think, the issue with education is it is so vastly complex. It's not just complicated, right? It's not, and then like if you deal with any bureaucracy, these are complicated. But education is complex. So you've got the issue, the bureaucratic complications, but then you also have, how do we serve individuals? How do we how does each individual learn? So it's an incredibly complex system. But I think one thing that if I could sort of wave my wand, I think we would have to address how funding happens in this country. I think basing funding off of property taxes.
Yep.
It really is just from the outset, it means that the more affluent children have a larger tax base in order to have better schools. And so it does seem as though sort of the way in which funding happens, and sure, we can throw different money, other kinds of money at education in order purportedly to level the playing field. But of course, that it's not leveling the playing field. And I think that in some ways, when we rely then in turn on philanthropy to purportedly sort of address some of these inequalities, we're really then beholden to what billionaires' visions of what the future of education should look like. And I wouldn't say that today's billionaires have a particularly good track record of for their educational endeavors.
Yeah. I would love to I'm thinking through, how much, does ed tech, the impact of just kind of how capitalism works, and usually these ed tech companies get funded, and this idea of getting venture capital or these funding has whole different types of kind of requirements or goals that are very different that impacting students and schools. What do you think of that dynamic? I mean, I know you are based in kind of the Bay Area, so you're kind of in the mecca of all that kind of happening too, where education tech companies are being funded, and it seems right off the get go their goals are going to be disconnected to helping support the poorest communities.
I think that that's true. And I think that what you have, and it's actually, I think it's in Silicon Valley in general, is that there's a great deal of dismissal of actual expertise. There's this idea that as an innovator, that you're actually someone who isn't beholden to the status quo or the people who know things. And so I think a lot of decisions get made by investors and entrepreneurs who just don't know a lot about education. I remember one time being told a story from the founder of a very successful and popular app, who shall remain nameless, that he had shown his investors the hockey stick curve of growth. And this is, of course, what investors like to see, that you see this sort of explosion in exponential growth of users of the software. But of course, the time period that this graph depicted was like August through October, when they went from like I'm exaggerating here, but like, 5 users to 5 million seemingly in the course of 2 weeks. And I thought, well, no, of course, because that's back to school. That's when everybody has to sign up for every new product. You didn't just suddenly have this sort of mass sea change in people that suddenly demonstrated interest in your product. You actually coincided this little snapshot that you gave to your investors with the time in which everyone is actually compelled to sign up and use your product. And so I think there are lots of ways in which the lack of expertise among entrepreneurs and investors really does a disservice. Oftentimes, I think what can be really great ideas that people have, but I think that once investors, particularly once you raise venture capital, the clock starts ticking,
Yeah.
and decisions start to get made that really aren't about in education. Everyone wants to say, we're doing this for the children, but very soon the decisions that get made are really about a return on investment for the venture capitalists. I mean, and that's just that's the way it works.
Yeah.
I mean, but I think it gets very challenging to make decisions that to sort of keep navigating your ship, if you will, by the right stars and not by this new shiny star that it's not even a star that guides you. They're pulling you in a certain direction.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the ed tech space is so big on the idea of scale and humanless need, no need for the humans to be involved. How do the less human touch or involvement, the better, which I think a lot of also kind of, seeing you in other interviews and things like that, you talk about these power of things that are happening in schools that really we can't explain or identify on the standardizations and outcomes that we're looking at because of these human connections that kids have with teachers and communities.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that COVID has really demonstrated. I mean, that even if you do have a video-based lesson that goes really well, right? It's still so remarkably different than the kinds of things that happen in person. And I think that human connection is so much of what education is, so much of what learning, teaching and learning are about. We are fundamentally social creatures. Learning is a way in which we enter the world and I think take part in the world socially with other people, with other people's ideas. Our ideas come in sort of, in friction and productive friction with other people. And so I think The idea for me of wanting to engineer that out in order to make things more efficient seems to be very contrary to to how I would envision, at least, a practice of education, really what it really should look like.
Yeah. I think, I think about the idea of like the stack, like of like our personal lives. We have Facebook to document our memories. We have Discord and Snapchat to message in our personal communities, and then we have kind of like this Reddit infinity group and forums to really dive in with these passionate places. And then in business, you have kind of Salesforce to track, accounts, and then Slack to interact with colleagues, and then like LinkedIn, with these kind of communities. I think a lot of, I guess, ed tech would say there's this opportunity for those spaces in education. And then there's, the idea of, as people get older, as millennials get older, and this work from home and knowledge based workers have more high school kids or middle school kids, as their employers have given them freedom, they would seek that freedom from their public education systems as well. Um, where do you feel like that those aspirations are real, or those are just all ideas from the space, but maybe not necessarily true?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would be really hesitant to sort of map so much of that software to our world. I think in some ways it really circumscribes the ways in which we can interact and be with one another, right? I think that there are only certain ways in which you can be a friend on Facebook, and I think that once we sort of hand over, you said, what did you say? Facebook is where we put our memories. And I think that it's, just to think about the way in which metaphor and analogies work,
Mm,
like I would be so reluctant to let that paradigm sort of dictate what socializing, what
hmm.
memory, what engagement. Like
Hmm.
engagement now is this weird word that sort of
Yeah.
has metric, like sort of metrics and time on screen and stuff attached to it.
Powerful.
I think maybe 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, when we would say, if we would say that student was really engaged in the lesson, we meant one thing. But now I think when we hand over the metaphors to tech,
Mm,
engagement means something really different and specific and quantifiable, and not necessarily quantifiable in the service of making education better. It just is sort of, it's some data. And so I think that, I think that what educate and I think that it's important to recognize that this, again, these sort of the way in which ed tech often works, it just looks so different for different kinds of students, right? I think that the ability to have a liberatory education, right? This idea of a progressive education that's liberatory, in which students get to pursue their own interests. That there are small classroom discussions. There's less discipline in terms of both behavior related and sort of intellectual disciplining even. That has always been the purview of this private schools for the wealthy, for the
hmm.
elites. And so when I hear people say that that's what they're interested in, it's worth unpacking what exactly they're imagining
Yeah.
schools to look like, and are they imagining that everyone gets to participate in that
Yeah.
kind of thing, or are they still like maybe that's what their children get, but there's still the sort of massive standardized, highly disciplined, surveilled existence for other people's children.
Yeah.
And a lot of ed tech entrepreneurs are very good at coming up with ideas for other people's children. Things that they would never want for themselves, never want for their own children, the kind of, I mean, drudgery and often degrading kinds of products that are for other people to keep other children in line, on track, focused, engaged.
Yeah, no, I love how you broke down engagement. You know, I think it has become such an interesting and murky word. I feel in this space. What would be some of your advice to superintendents, principals, people who are maybe feeling like, hey, you know, I want to feel more, I guess, servicing my kids. I have funding. I'm getting calls all the time from these people's sales teams. What would you be looking at if you were leading a school and how you would fund different things?
I think that my first piece of advice, and that's not just for principals, it's for all of us really, is that to remember that none of this is inevitable, right? There isn't, I mean, I think that that's the story that technology really likes to tell, is that we have no choice, right? The future will be fill in the blank, digital, the future will be robots, the future will be on Mars, the future is brain implants, and that somehow we can't stop it. We're on this train, and there's no going back. And I've heard a lot of this, particularly during the pandemic, from ed tech entrepreneurs, but I mean, from other people as well, that there's no turning back. Now that students have moved online, we'll never go back. We'll never go back to the classroom. We'll never go back to how things were. And I think that the future is not inevitable. The idea that the future will be more technological isn't inevitable. I think that we do actually have a voice. When I say we, I mean parents, students, teachers, principals, citizens, people who don't, taxpayers, people who don't have children in the school system. We do actually have a say in what the future looks like. We don't actually have to hand over the keys to the car to a privatized to the technology industry and its vision for the
Yeah.
future. So I mean, I think that we can say no, and I think people do say no, and I think it's important to listen when people say no. I think we're really quick when people are reticent to use technology. I think we react really quickly. We label them. We would label them Luddites, or we say that they're standing in the face, standing in the way of
Yeah.
change. And I think it's important when someone says no, when someone is resistant to using a technology, it's worth asking more about what's going on, because very rarely is it just there's often reasons, and I think that they're valid reasons. And so I think resistance, we're seeing a lot of resistance to technology coming from students, for example, who it might be a small act of resistance. It might not be protesting a particular piece of software. It might be a small act of resistance, like not turning the camera on
Mm.
on a Zoom, for example, or finding different ways to work around having to use a specific technology. So
Mhm.
those acts of resistance, I think, are really important, particularly for administrators to think about. Not just say we must have total compliance, but actually stop and think about why people are saying no. And you know, I embrace the being called a Luddite. I would say that the Luddites have been sort of maligned in history. That the Luddites weren't. It's important to remember that the Luddites were not anti-technology, right? The Luddites were weavers. During the Industrial Revolution, they used machines. They used machines to make cloth. What the Luddites were opposed to were being forced to become factory workers. They were opposed to exploitative practices. They were opposed to having their ownership of the machine being taken away from them, and so that they had to work on someone else's machines and not get a say in what the cloth looked like, not get to own the cloth that they created,
Mm.
to have all of that value extracted from them and be given a wage instead. And so I think that that's such a great metaphor, actually, for technology right now, and for what happens with data and what happens with students' data,
Yeah.
right? Is so that students are building all of this cloth, right? They are weaving all of this cloth in the work that they do in schools, and it's actually being extracted from them. The value is being extracted from them. And so I think we can say no to that extraction, right? We can say no to that exploitation of
Yeah.
students. And that doesn't mean we don't use computers, right? That doesn't mean we don't use the machines. It actually means we have to find ways to use them that aren't based on taking something of value and extracting it from students and leaving them with a less than a less than living wage, if you will, a less
Yeah.
than livable life. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my last question, and thank you for coming on ednews.com. My last question is, if you had to start an ed tech company, where would you explore your time and investment and energy in?
Oh, I don't think I would start an ed tech company. That's just, I mean, I know I'll play along with the question, Audrey, but I think for me, it would actually be, if I had to start something, it would be to work to get, I think, surveillance technology out of schools.
Powerful.
I think that that's really so important. Thinking about the ways in which ed tech is now used to police, quite literally
Yeah.
police students. And I think that it doesn't just, as I said earlier, it doesn't just further exacerbate educational inequalities, but it actually puts students' lives at risk. And I think that I would actually work to have some sort of anti-police technology, literally and figuratively, is the future I want to see in schools, are schools that are not based on surveillance tech.
Mm. Well, I'm really excited that we had this conversation. Really learned a ton, and thank you so much for coming on to Ed
Thank
News
you.
now.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.